So this polymorphism can be implemented by making use of a concept called overloading. When the object is going to take more than one form that will be based on the different scenario, we are going to call that mechanism as what? Overloading. So here binding is nothing but process of connecting one program to another program. Hello everyone, welcome back to the session 2 on chapter 6, that is basic concepts of OOP. Myself Rohini is from the Department of Computer Science, Vidhyaashram Pre-University College, Mysuru. So in our first session of this chapter, we learned about object-oriented programming. So in that I have discussed which are the programming languages were there. That means you have to consider procedural-oriented programming. Along with that, I also discussed regarding the structured programming. Then we learned some of the things regarding the object-oriented programming. So which is the main thing that we are going to consider in object-oriented programming? That is data. So data can be anything. So then it will going to comprise of both data members and member function. And also I have discussed the difference between object-oriented programming and POP, that is nothing but procedural-oriented programming. So where the data can be hidden and where the security for the data will be there, whether it is in the object-oriented programming or procedural-oriented programming, and which are the programming languages which comes under OOP or POP, everything that I have discussed in the difference between object-oriented programming and procedural-oriented programming. And also we learned some of the concept, that is what? Basic concept of object-oriented programming. Then how we are going to remember all those things? Then I have given a code, that is what? PM will going to say OD to whom? That is for CID, right? So polymorphism, message passing, objects, data encapsulation, and we have overloading, data abstraction, classes, inheritance and dynamic binding. These are the basic concept of object-oriented programming languages. So in this I have covered objects, classes and all. So in our today's session we are going to learn about polymorphism and overloading. Then we are going to learn about the dynamic binding. So what do you mean by binding? So when it will be called as dynamic binding, everything that I am going to discuss. Along with that we have one more concept called message passing. Then advantages of object-oriented programming. Then disadvantages. Along with that we are going to discuss about the applications of object-oriented programming language. So now we'll see what do you mean by polymorphism. So here we have two words, poly and morphism. So what it means? So poly is nothing but that represents many, and morphism is nothing but forms. So together we can say it as what? Many forms. Then which will going to take many forms? We'll see now. So the ability of an operator and a function. So we know what is operator and we know what is function. When the operator and function has the ability to take multiple form, that is what? More than one form, then we are going to call that mechanism as polymorphism. Okay. So an ability of an operator and a function will going to take more than one form, then that mechanism is called as what? Polymorphism. Okay. So here poly means many and morphism means forms. It will going to take more than one form that will be based on the scenario or that will be based on the context. Okay. So that is regarding this polymorphism. So this polymorphism can be implemented by making use of a concept called overloading. We are going to implement the polymorphism mechanism by making use of one more concept called overloading. So here we'll see what do you mean by overloading and what are the types of overloading we have. So overloading will going to allow the object to have different meaning depending on the context. So we know what do you mean by object, right? That comprises of what? Data member it has, and it has what? Member function. So together we are going to call that single unit as an object. So when an object will going to have a different meaning for the different scenario, then we are going to call that mechanism as overloading. So for example, consider yourself. Okay, consider you as a girl or a boy. So when you are in the college, when you are inside the college, you are going to play the role of student. But when you get back to your home, then you will be again going to play a role of daughter, son or a brother, sister, like that. That means what? You will be same, but your role will going to be changed, depends on the situation or depends on the context or a scenario where you are exactly. So that is what this object will going to take different forms which will be based on different scenario. When the object is going to take more than one form that will be based on the different scenario, we are going to call that mechanism as what? Overloading. Then we have two types of overloading in C++. Okay, it can be either operator overloading and function overloading. So we'll see the types now. So there are two types of overloading. One is operator overloading and another one is function overloading. So we all know that what do you mean by operator and what is function, right? So operators is nothing but what? That is a symbol. So if I consider any symbol that will going to act differently for different scenario, then that will be what we are going to call that as operator overloading. Then we have function overloading. So function in the sense set of instruction which will going to perform a particular task. So it has to perform a particular task. Then we are going to call that set of instruction as a function. That will be like what? Semi-programs. So that will going to perform a particular task. Then what is overloading here? That to function overloading. That means what? When two or more function have a same name. So I have two or more function in my program and all the function will going to have a same name, but that will going to be differs in the number of arguments and data type of the arguments. That is what we are going to call it as a function overloading. Okay. For example, you consider plus, that is for operator overloading. So why we are going to use this operator called plus? As we all know that that is mainly used to add. So what and all I can add by making use of the plus? I can add whole numbers, also add fractional numbers, and we can also use this plus operator or a plus symbol in order to add the characters, that is what single letter, and if it is a group of character then we are going to call that as a string. So can I use the same plus operator for all these scenario? Yes, we can use. That means what? An operator will going to act same for all the types of scenario. Then that will going to be overloaded. We are going to use the same operator for different purpose. That is what we are going to call that as operator overloading. So let me tell you. So 2 plus 3. I can also use this plus in order to add the whole numbers. Then 2.5 plus 3.2. Here also I am using, for example, A, B, C, D. Okay, this is string. So if I add it together, I am going to get A, B, C, D. Right? That is what an operator will be same, but it will going to act differently for different scenarios. Then we are going to call that as a operator overloading. Then how this function overloading works? So you just take an example, real-time example of a paint. Okay, so where and all we are going to use a paint? We can use the same paint in order to paint the building of hospital and buildings of school, colleges or any of the building, right? So that means what? Its operation will be same and we are going to call that paint as the same name everywhere. But the type we are using or the different scenarios that we are using will going to be differ. That is what we are going to call that as a function overloading. Okay. So this is related to what? Operator overloading and function overloading. And if you consider a function called shape, so I can use the same function name in order to illustrate either circle or triangle or rectangle. So all these are the shapes. So we are going to use the different data types and we are going to use the number of different arguments here. But the name of a function will be same. That is what it means of this function overloading. So polymorphism in the sense, poly, many, and morphism is forms. So when an object will going to take more than one form, that will be based on the context or a scenario, we are going to call that as a polymorphism. That will be implemented by making use of this overloading. So it can be operator overloading or a function overloading. So operator in the sense, any symbols, and function will going to perform a particular task. So this is regarding polymorphism and overloading. So next, what concept we have when it comes to the basic concept of OOPs? That is what we have, dynamic binding. Dynamic binding. So why binding is important? So as we take as a real-time example, binding. So what is the need? So tied up together, right? Then when we are working with computers, so what and all we are going to tie? So for example, if I am going to write a complete program, then it has to be compiled, it has to process. If there is any errors, it will going to be displayed on a screen, and after that we are going to run it successfully when there is no bugs, right? But what if I am going to write header file in one file and declaration in another file, or variable usage statements of that cout and cin, everything in the different file? How it going to look like? So everything will be in the different file. But when we are computing or when we are executing, it has to be in a single code, or it has to be like bundle, right? So that means what? We are binding in the sense we are going to combine, or we are going to integrate one or more function or one or more program together. That is what we are going to call that as a binding. So when this binding will going to happen in the runtime or during the execution of a program, then we are going to call that as a dynamic binding. So here binding is nothing but process of connecting one program to another program. For example, in one program I am going to write a program in order to find the sum and subtraction or difference of the two numbers. But in another program, I am going to work with multiplication, division and modulus. But here I have two programs, that is program 1 and program 2. But now I want all these operations to be together. At that time, what we are going to do? We are going to use both program 1 and program 2 together. So now it will become another program. Okay, so this binding or linking or connecting of one program to another program, then we are going to call that methodology as what? Binding. Then when this binding will going to occur during the execution of a program, then that will be called as what? Dynamic binding. So we'll see now, dynamic binding is the process of linking the procedure call to a specific sequence of code or a function at runtime or during the execution of a program. So when we are going to combine this procedure call to a specific set of code, that will be during the program execution or a runtime, then that mechanism will be called as what? Dynamic binding. So we'll see the next basic concept of OOPS, that is what? Message passing. So why message passing is important? How many objects can be created for a class? Is it 1, 2, 3 or how much? Can we create thousands of objects for a particular class? Yes, we can. That means what? There is no restriction over creating of an object for a particular class. So we can create any number of objects to a particular class. Then why this message passing is important? So why we want to pass a message? So consider there will be n number of objects in a particular class. But if I want to communicate or if you want to process the data, then there must be a communication between the objects. So that object communication will going to happen with the help of this message passing method or a concept. Okay. So this object-oriented programming processing is going to be done by sending a message to the objects. So then object will going to call the data members and member function. Then we are going to perform or then we are going to execute or process the things. So that is why message passing is important. So message for an object is request for the execution of a procedure. For example, you have created a class and I have created a class called student. Okay, so I have a class called student and I have created two objects like S1 and S2. Okay, so these two are the object of a class called student. I want to access the data members and member functions of this particular class. At that time, what we are going to do? We are going to use this object name, then that data member or a member function name. So let me take this as read and display. Okay, so read and display. So what will going to happen now? I'm sending a message to the object. What I'm saying? You have to execute now. So you have to execute the procedure. That means what? We are making it active. So we are calling this methodology or we are calling this method, that too by making use of this objects. So that is what the reason of using this message passing. See here, message for an object is a request for the execution of a procedure. We are requesting it to proceed or to the execution of a procedure. Then what and all must contain in the message passing? What and all I am supposed to send? We'll see now. So message passing involves specifying the name of the object. So what and all I have to send? I have to give the name of an object. So what is the name of an object? Then name of the function, or what is the procedure that we have. For example, here what? I am going to take read and display as a name of a function. Okay. So let me consider here S1 and S2 are the object name, and functions are what? Read and display. Then what it must contain? So it must include name of an object, the name of a function or a message, and the information to be sent. So I am going to take the student name, register number, course, and I am going to display it. So what and all it will going to comprise of? We have a name of an object and we have a name of a function. So why we require function here? To make it active or request for the execution of a procedure. So procedure is nothing but function. So for that purpose, we require all these things. So this is regarding message passing. So there will be n number of objects. In order to have a communication between one object to another object, then message passing is important. Okay. So now we'll see the advantages of OOPS. So now we are done with what? Basic concept of OOPS. Object, classes, inheritance, polymorphism, data encapsulation, data abstraction, and message passing, then dynamic binding. So now we'll see what are the advantages we have when we are using object-oriented programming. So when you are writing in advantages of an object-oriented programming, you have to write in terms of its concept, how this inheritance will going to be helpful, how object and classes will going to be helpful. In that manner, you have to write the advantages of an object-oriented programming. As we all know that we are going to use a modular approach in object-oriented programming. That means what? We are not supposed to consider a problem as a single task. Instead of that, we have to divide it into number of subtasks or a sub-modules or a sub-programs or a problems. Then we have to find a solution for each sub-problem. At last, we have to integrate, right? So now, based on that, how the modular approach will going to work. So then which concept we are going to use in order to make the implementation of a modular approach, everything we'll see now. That is regarding advantages of an object-oriented programming. The programs are modularized based on the principle of classes and objects. So how we are going to do now? As I discussed, we are not going to consider it as a single problem. Instead of that, it will be considered as a different module, so that programs are modularized. So based on which concept now we are using? Classes and objects. So each object will going to perform its own task. It will be having its own characteristics and function. So if I combine all the objects together, then that will going to give us what? Class. So in modular approach also, all the subprogram will going to be integrated at last. So modularization will going to be happen with the help of this objects and classes concepts. So like linking code and object will going to allows the related object to share common code. So as we all know that it can be having any number of objects, right? And each object will going to have its own characteristics and behavior or a function that it will going to perform. But when I want to copy the same thing to the another program, then what and all we are doing? So we are going to use this methodology called what? We are going to copy the content of one object to another object. That means what? That will going to reduce the code duplication. No need to write it again from the scratch. Okay, so no need to write again from the beginning to the end. Already we have designed, we have implemented, and we have tested. So if everything is perfect, then what is the perk of taking that into another program? So there will be no difficulty in taking that content to another program or a problem. That is what here, this will going to reduce is the code duplication. That means no need to write the same code again. I can just call that function or a program and we can use it simply. So that it will going to be work with code reusability. So linking code and object. So we are going to link the code and that object will going to allow the related object to going to be shared a common features. So if you want to use the content of another object, that is helpful or can be used in the advantages as an advantage of the object-oriented programming. So next, creation and implementation of a object-oriented code is easy and reduces the software development time. So there is no restriction over creation of an object, right? We can create any number of objects. By taking this point, that means what? Creation and implementation of an object code. Everything will be used as what? Object. By making use of that concept, that creation and implementation is not so difficult. So if it is not so difficult, then it has to be easy and that will going to reduce us the software development time. How it will going to reduce us the software development time? Already if we have some set of objects which has been implemented, tested and everything is set, then we can just copy it or we can use the code, that is what? Code reusability. If there is a flexibility of code reusability, obviously it will going to reduce the time of software development. So that in this way it will going to be helpful when we are working with this object-oriented programming. So the concept of data abstraction will going to separate object specification and object implementation. If I take an example of the ATM, there we know how to operate, but we doesn't know how it is working in a background or how it is working internally, right? That means what? Data abstraction, what is the essential content required for the user, only that will going to be displayed. That will going to be separate this object specification and object implementation. Object specification in the sense what? We know how to operate it, but we doesn't know how it has been implemented. So that is what the reason of using this data abstraction. This is also one of the important advantage when it comes to the object-oriented programming. So we'll see the next point. Data encapsulated along with a function. When the object-oriented programming, there everything will be considered as data and objects, right? When data and functions are combined together as a single unit, then that will going to provide a security for the data. Confidentiality will be there and privacy for the data will be there. No external function will going to access that. That is one of the advantage of using this data encapsulation concept, which comes under basic concept of OOPS. Data encapsulated along with a function, so that external non-member function cannot access or cannot modify that data. Okay, so if you consider this as what? Object that comprises of what? Data and also comprises of a function, right? So data and functions are bundled together as a single unit. If I want to access it from the outside, then it will going to be restricted, right? So non-member function, which is not a member of that particular class, cannot access that data. So if it is not possible, then there will be a security for the data. Confidentiality can be maintained. There will be a privacy for the data. That is also one of the important thing. We cannot modify it. We cannot change it. So if everything is possible, then there will be no security for the data. If I am able to access your social media account, or if I am able to change the password of yours, then what is the use of using all those things? If there is no security, then there is no usage, right? In the same way, if there is access for the external non-member function, then there will be no security. So in order to make a security, or in order to bundle the data and function together as a single unit, we are going to use this data encapsulation concept, so that it will going to provide data security. So next, what is the next advantage we have? We'll see now. Easier to develop complex software. How it is easier to develop a complex software? We'll see, because complexity can be minimized with the help of this inheritance concept. Already we know what is inheritance, how it works, what is base class, what is derived class, which class will going to acquire the features of another class, everything that we have discussed, right? So code reusability can be happen by making use of this inheritance concept. So with the help of this inheritance concept, I can copy the code of another class to my new class, so that it will going to reduce the complexity of that development of a software. That means also it will going to reduce the software development time. So this is one of the advantage of using inheritance. Code reusability will be there and flexibility will be there. No need to write a same program or a same procedure again from the scratch. We can directly use it, or we can acquire the features of already existing class. So that this can also be considered as one of the advantage of using this object-oriented programming. So OOP can communicate with through function passing, which will going to act as an interface description with the outside system. Very simple. I want to communicate with one object to another object. So then how can I communicate it? So consider there will be n number of objects. I want to have a communication between one object to another object. Then how it will be possible? This message passing methodology will going to act as an interface. So we are going to link the code with objects. So by making use of this object name, function name, and what is the message to be sent, everything will be integrated together, so that will going to be simple when we want to transfer a message from one object to another object. Okay, so this is one of the advantage of this object-oriented programming. So now we'll see what are the disadvantages we have. So we already know about this procedural-oriented programming, structured. So now we discussed about the object-oriented programming. But what will be your question? Do we have a disadvantages even in object-oriented programming? Yes, we have. So we'll see what are the disadvantages we have. After assuming or after analyzing all the basic concept of OOPs, so some of the disadvantages that you can make out. So what are the disadvantages we have in object-oriented programming? We'll see this larger program size. If I want to build a software for a complex one, or if I am performing or if we are developing a software for the complex task, then can we write 2 lines of code for that? Obviously no. So then it will be what? Larger in a program size. That could also be considered as what? One of the disadvantage. So that is what? Larger program size. So when you compare this procedural oriented programming and object oriented programming will going to have more lines of code than that POP. So that it will be considered as what? Larger program size. But it will going to solve a problem, or it will going to implement the real-time scenarios. But the lines of code or the size of a program will be larger. What is the next disadvantage we have? Slower programs. You just analyze one thing. If the number of code of line is more, then it will going to take exactly the slower execution. That means what? Slower programs. If the number of lines of code are more, then for the execution it will take more time. So that can also be considered as what? Disadvantage of an object-oriented programming. So typically it will be slower than the procedure based on the programs. So if the program is too lengthy, then it will going to take more time, right? If it is short, or if it is in the terms of moderate length of code, then it will be easy. So that as they typically require more instruction to be executed. Are we going to implement a simple or a complex software just by writing 2-3 lines of code? Obviously not. So that when the number of codes are increased, then it will going to slow down the execution of a program. That is what those two will be considered as what? Disadvantage. So if you are working with a real-time system, then it has to be very fast in the execution. It has to affect in a fraction of seconds. So that this can also be considered as what? One of the disadvantage in the object-oriented programming. So next, not suitable for all the types of programs. So we cannot use this object-oriented programming in order to solve all the kinds of problems, or we cannot use all these concepts of a OOPs in order to perform all the kinds of programs. So that means what? Somehow it is restricted to solve some type of problem. So that we cannot use all the concept of a OOPs in order to solve all the types of problem. So based on our problem, we must be wise enough to choose the type of methodology that we wanted to solve that problem. Okay, user or developer has to be wise enough to choose the topic or a methodology in order to solve those kind of programs or problems. So to convert a real world problem into the object-oriented module is difficult. So we came up with a new concept called OOP, right? So why we came up with a new concept called OOP? That is what was the disadvantage of structured oriented programming. So in order to, it is somehow difficult in order to implement the real world scenario or real world application. But this object oriented programming will going to solve all those things. Though somehow it will going to be difficult, that is what we cannot implement all the real-time scenarios only by making use of this object-oriented programming. Along with that, we must take any other concept which will going to complement it in order to implement the complex software. Okay, so that here somehow it will be difficult in order to convert the real-time object or a real-world problem in terms of object-oriented programming. So if we are considering a real world problem in terms of object oriented programming, everything will be considered as an object. So we have to find out its data members, member function, and how we are going to wrap it. Everything we have to consider. So that somehow it will be difficult. So now OOPS software development, debugging and testing tools are not standardized. So there will be more flexibility. There is no restriction over using the concept, or there is no restriction over using any of the testing tool or a development tool, debugging tool. If there is no standardization, there will be a huge number of flexibility. So that could also be considered as what? One of the disadvantage. So what you are going to do if there is no traffic rules? There will be more accidents. So in the same way, if there is no standardization in the tool, if there is no standardization in the debugging, testing or a development, user will going to use the concept as their wish. So that means what? There can be a possibility of the spoiling of those things. So that can also be considered as one of the disadvantage. So when the development, testing, debugging tools are not standardized, then that will be overgeneralized. There will be more flexibility. That can also be one of the disadvantage. Polymorphism and dynamic binding also requires processing time due to overload of this function call during the runtime. We are going to implement this polymorphism and dynamic binding during the execution of a program. When we are executing that program, then there must be no interruption. But when we are using this binding of a message or binding of a program one to another program, that will going to take a time and that will going to increase the execution time, so that it will become slower in execution. That could also be considered as what? One of the disadvantage of this object oriented programming. So next, the classes are overly generalized. As I told, there is no standardization. So you can use as ever you want. So that there is no standardization, it will be over generalized. So that is also one of the disadvantage of this object oriented programming. I hope you all understood with advantages and disadvantages. So based on the concept only, we are going to write its advantages along with the disadvantages. So now we'll see what are the applications of object oriented programming we have. So where and all can we use this object oriented programming concept, or what are the basic concept of OOPS can be implemented in a particular field. That will going to give us what? Applications of an object oriented programming. So this question will be important for 5 marks. So mention or list out the real-time examples or application for object oriented programming. So now we'll see the list of applications of this object oriented programming. Where and all can we use this? That is what? Computer graphics application. So as we all know that it will going to provide a user interface, right? So for the Windows, we are going to have a user interface which will be more user friendly. So in all those scenarios, we are going to have this computer graphics application. There we can use the basic concept of OOPS and CAD CAM software. So here CAD represent computer aided design and CAM is computer aided manufacturing. So if you just imagine a virtual building, how it will going to be look like once it is built, so that we can have the walkthrough into the virtual building before it is going to be built. So that can be happen by making use of this CAD CAM software. This can be implemented or developed by making use of this basic concept of OOPS. Okay, so that in this area also we can use the object oriented programming concept. There will be virtualization. For the virtualization or for 3D images and all, and during the engineering works, there we are going to use this CAD and CAM softwares. So next we have object-oriented database. In this field also we are going to use this object and classes concept. Everything will be generalized so that there will be huge flexibility. So that next, user interface design such as Windows. So in order to implement all these things, we are going to use any of the basic concept of OOPS. But developer must be able to understand which concept should I use in order to get the benefit. So that then only the utilization of all these basic concepts will going to be more effective and efficient. So real-time system, simulation and modeling, this is all related to what? Networking. So simulation in the sense what? There will be a movement of the data, and modeling. For all those things we are going to have this object-oriented concepts. Then artificial intelligence and expert system. We are trying to make a computer wise, or it has to take, or it has to think by its own, and it has to take the decision. For all those things, for the expert system, we are making use of some of the concept of this object-oriented programming, and also client server system. So these are the applications of an object-oriented programming. So advantages, disadvantages and application. These three questions are very, very important for 3-mark question. So we are done with the chapter called Basic Concepts of OOPS. So now we'll see what are the important questions that you can expect from this chapter. As we all know that totally it will be for 7 marks, right? 2 marks 1 question, 5 mark 1 question. Then what are the possibilities of asking 2 marks question? So that can be asked related to class, object. So remember one thing, by making use of the basic concept of OOPS, any concept can be asked for 2 marks. Along with that, you can see the another question, what is base class and what is derived class. So here base class and derived class can also be appeared in the inheritance chapter. But when they are asking related to base class and a derived class, so base class is also called as super class or a parent class, the class which is giving its properties to the new class. So the class which is acquiring the properties from another class are called as derived class. So this is related to 2-mark question. So now we also have the 5 marks question. So difference between POP and OOP, very, very important question. Then characteristics. So characteristics or a basic concept of OOP. Everything is same. Don't get confused. So if they ask you to write all these 2 questions, if they ask you to write either characteristics or a basic concept, don't get confused. Both are same. Then we have advantages, disadvantages and application. These 3 questions are very, very important for 5-mark question. I hope you all understood with this object-oriented concept or a basic concepts of OOPS. So let me meet you in the next session with a new chapter. Until that, keep learning, keep on growing. Thank you.